All right, we can all hear me. Yes, I am mic'd. How lovely to see all of you. Good morning, Edinburgh. I had this whole bit prepared about how the weather was meant to be really rubbish and at least you'd come out and I could maybe brighten up your day. But we actually managed to get lovely sunny weather. I'm so happy about that. And I'm here today to talk to you about how gamers are not who you think they are. And we're going to talk a little bit about maybe who gamers might actually be and why I would care about that as a problem. So I'm Caitlin Goodale. Oops. Hello. I'm from a little village called Aberdare. Some of you might have seen it on the way if you've got the train up to Dundee. It's a tiny little village. I really recommend you visiting it. But I went to school in Edinburgh, so I'm at home here. But right now I live in another beautiful place called Malmö in Sweden. You may know this place from the bridge that goes over to Copenhagen. I promise there's not as many murders as that show would imply. And I work as a UX designer, so a user experience designer. And in games, that kind of means being the person who ties together what the game designers are trying to do and the ideas that they're trying to show through their game with the artists and how the artists want to express themselves. So being the glue between those two roles. And in my spare time, I'm an illustrator. I love graphic design. I'm also an avid rock climber and probably the world's biggest Antiques Roadshow fan. So any Antiques Roadshow fangirls, hit me up. We can talk about it. But my real passion is games and figuring out how to design for millions and millions of users. I grew up playing games wrong. When I played Pokemon Yellow, if my Pikachu fainted in battle, I would actually turn off my Game Boy Color to reset it because I didn't want my Pikachu to get sad, because that would happen. When I played Mass Effect, I made Excel spreadsheets to make sure that my characters had an even distribution of gear and things that would fit both their personalities and their playstyles. And I was always the person that would click on every item in a menu, every option, either to see if the developers had hidden something exciting there, or even if it was broken, if there was something about the game that was secret and I could find it. So naturally, when I grew up for real, I became a UX designer. My job on a day-to-day basis is looking through systems, figuring out how they work, breaking them, and trying to make them better. So this has taken me to some quite exciting places. I know Alex mentioned a few of them already. Right now, I work at King in Malmö. It's a lovely place. But before this, I worked at Microsoft in London. And those are some totally different UX challenges. I was working both with mobile games and with the HoloLens. So you have the challenges of figuring out how bright does text need to be when you're looking at it in augmented reality? Or what sort of fonts can you use? What sort of sizes can you use? What sort of motion can you use? Before that, when I was at 4J Studios, which is a company up in Dundee, they do the console versions of Minecraft. So you have a totally different set of problems. How do you figure out, your main audience is children? How do you figure out how much they understand? What level of language they have? What conventions that they have within games? And now at King, we design games for like almost a third of the world's population, millions and millions of people, and that comes with its own set of challenges, some of which I'm going to bring you through today. So traditionally, UX design, I think, asks binary questions. A lot of the time what you're asking is, can the user complete a purchase? Can they get to a specific page in your website? But I find game UX design much more ephemeral. You're asking questions that are much harder to quantify a lot of the time. Things like, is this fun? Is it enjoyable? How does the user feel when they're there? These very airy-fairy questions. And that is actually really hard to quantify. It's hard to find stats about that and to measure them. So to me, I would say game UX is about balancing effort and ease. What I mean by this is you want stuff to be, the stuff that you want your user to be frustrated by, you want it to be as easy to get there as possible. So you want your user to be focusing on solving this really tricky puzzle or getting through this battle, as opposed to which button do I press? How does this menu work? I don't understand. We've all seen the effects of bad UX in real life. Whether you've used a stovetop where the hobs don't really correlate to the buttons, and so you end up turning one on and shattering a plate that was sitting on the I've done this. Or you're the sort of person that walks into doors because you kind of assume you're meant to pull it, but then you can't pull it, you have to push it because the shape of the handle doesn't really correlate to the way that the door actually works. These are some pretty obvious examples of like things where the person designing this didn't really think about their intended user. But this is no different in games, I would say. So this is a mobile game. It's like a Japanese kind of battle RPG game. And in the top example, it takes you 5 screens to get from opening the app to being able to play a game. I know we probably have some user experience designers in the office who, or in the audience, not the office, who would say, that's pretty bad, that's a lot of screens. I don't think that's a problem for a lot of games. They're complex. However, if you decide that you actually want to change which characters you're using halfway through this process, it kicks you right back to the start. So you end up taking 22 screens to actually getting able to play a game. And that's obviously not optimal. But really, game UX is also about thinking about the whole picture of what you need to be doing when you're playing games. So it's not just about what's happening in the game, but it's about when you buy it, the fact that you have to get a day one patch that takes 6 hours and 6 gigabytes of memory to download is not optimal from like a player experience point of view. It doesn't make people feel good. So this gets me thinking, you know, when I'm asking these strange ephemeral questions to myself, what is the game really? So I'd like you to close your eyes, everyone, and picture, like, what is the first game that comes to your mind's eye? Okay, you can open them. So I'm imagining some of you might have said, like, a shooter like Call of Duty, GTA, made here at Edinburgh. Some of you might have said Minecraft, mentioned it earlier. Some of you might think Candy Crush or a mobile game. Some people in the audience maybe thought something like football or a sports thing. If you said that one, you get extra points. But did anyone think of bridge? Bridge is played by thousands of people, millions of people. And by conservative estimates, it actually takes a 1.5 years of intensive playing to be somewhat competent. I don't know about you guys, but to me that's a hardcore game. But it doesn't really have the traditional audience, I would say, for hardcore gamers. Did anyone think about Airplane or games you play with your kids? Things like I Spy, where you're just trying to keep them not bugging you for as long as possible. Did anyone think about hopscotch or games with rules as malleable as what you can draw on the ground and immediately erase? When we actually think about what games are as a medium and what they could be, it's so much broader than these like digital products that we would think of immediately. And there are so many more options within this space of what we could make and what we could create. And I like Jane McGonigal's description. This is because it's quite simple of what a game needs to be. For something to be a game, it needs to have goals. You need to have something you're aiming for. It needs to have rules. There needs to be some constraints within that to foster your creativity. There needs to be a feedback system. You need to know how you're doing within the game. And there needs to be voluntary participation. So you need to be choosing to play this game. And I hear you out there. Why are we having this academic argument, Caitlin? Why do we care about what the definition of a game is anyway? Well, I think it's core to my work and core to how I think about my work because it ties into what a gamer is. If games are broader than we thought they might be, then gamers must be broader as well, right? Now, I'm going to reel it back a bit. Because I'm working with digital products, we're going to start speaking about specifically people who are playing digital games. So this is me looking very tired, almost like I've just woken up and it's 8:30 in the morning and I'm only on my 3rd coffee. And this is me at Creative Mornings in Malmö. So I also attend. I think it's a super cool community, which is why I was so happy to speak here. And we had a speaker who was amazing. She was a user experience designer, but for events and parties. So she designed the whole feel of going to an event and going somewhere. And this interested me so much because my other main hobby is trying to throw awesome parties. So I went up to speak to her afterwards. And she was very well put together, very stylish, Swedish, in her maybe late 40s, early 50s, and I mentioned that I did game UX, and she said, "Oh, I like games." And immediately my mind came to the assumption of, okay, she probably likes mobile games. Will I have to explain to her like digital product design and UX versus UI and these sort of things? Because you do start to make assumptions about people after a while. And so I asked her what sort of games are you playing? She sits and thinks for a bit and she says, well, I was big into Doom in the early DOS days, but then, I kind of fell out of it for a while. But I started my own World of Warcraft guild, and we had this organizational hierarchy, and I ran that, and we were like topping our server, and I was stunned. I mean, I was so happy. It was so exciting to hear from her, but she totally broke down my expectations of the sort of gamer I thought she was going to be. And this is an example I like to use because I like to think that I'm trying to break down bias all the time and figure out who is actually playing games, but I still had those immediate assumptions about the sort of gamer she would be. And maybe you have had or have those assumptions too. Either you have kind of middle-aged women playing casual mobile games, or you have teenage boys in their bedrooms yelling obscenities at each other. But actually, 44% of the world's population play games, and like digital games. And then we consider the fact that half the world's population don't actually have internet access. So really, everyone who's on the internet, everyone has a mobile phone, is playing games in some way, shape, or form. And this is backed up by the stats. Again, it's not just boys. I'm sure most of you know this, but this is the gender split for people playing games in the US. And now it's 42% women, 59% men, something like that. So it's pretty equal. However, when we start to look at the games industry, it's a different case. So this is showing in 2017, only 26% of people working in the games industry worldwide identified as female or as other. And you see, compared to the fact that it's almost 50-50 of people playing games, the fact that we're not really that diverse at all when it comes to people making them kind of starts to be a problem. And I know some of you might say, well, why is this an issue? We can design for people that are not like ourselves, we're very open-minded. But it is a problem, because when we're surrounded by people similar to us, we start to make assumptions about people that are not within that group. It's like when we're in a homogenous environment, we see outsiders very differently, and we make decisions that wouldn't serve them. So this is from a talk given by Trisha Wang a few years ago. There's a conference in Malmo called The Conference. It's a really excellent design conference. I really recommend it. And she talked about the Malkovich bias. So this is the idea that other people use technology in the same way that you do. And this really resonated with me because especially when you're surrounded by people who are working in the high-tech space, are digital natives, you start to assume that other people understand as much about the way their phones work, about digital stuff that they might not actually have. This becomes a bigger problem when we think about the fact that games are not just the games industry is not just skewed in terms of gender. It's also skewed in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of age, and also in terms of the types of games we like to play. I'm sure some of you work within the games industry or know it, but you have to be quite hardcore to get in. It's very competitive. There's few jobs. There's hard working hours. And so you end up actually having a lot of people who, have this real burning passion for it, and they tend to like specific sorts of games. This is a thing called the Quantic Foundry Player Motivations Chart. And if you're a person who is in any way interested in games, I recommend going and looking this up online, because it's a test you can take. It takes 5 minutes, and it asks you questions about the things that you enjoy about playing games. And then once you've completed the test, it computes your answers and it tells you what the motivators are for you for playing games. So this is my chart. So we can see here, obviously, I love discovery, learning new things, like listening to the stories developers are telling me. I'm kind of interested in completion, so like getting stars or like completing a sticker book or whatever, and in fantasy, in things that are outside of my normal life. But I really hate competition and challenge and not really into excitement. Ugh, excitement, who wants that? And this becomes more interesting because the people that make this, Quantic Foundry, have crunched the data on like the gender gap and how like men and women tend to like games differently. And it turns out there is some correlation. Women tend to like games that are in, I think it's completion and the fantasy space. And men tend to like challenge and excitement, I think it is. Don't quote me. But the really interesting thing is when we start to break it down by age, as opposed to by gender, it's almost as correlated. So young people tend to prefer a specific sort of games, and older people tend to prefer specific sorts of games. So it's not all about gender. It's not this bias and this stereotype we have that, oh, you know, women just like casual games, blah, blah, blah. It's so much more nuanced and complex than that. And maybe this is why some people find video games boring. This is a piece by an amazing speaker, actually, called Brie Code. And she published it a few years ago in gamesindustry.biz, which is one of the biggest games industry publications, basically saying, games as we make them now suck. They're boring. They don't serve so many people in the world. And she was saying here that she has friends who are like really big into arts and media and tech, and they love film and TV and music, and yet they see no value in games. They think that games have nothing to offer as an art form. And maybe that's because we're not serving these people. We're making games for ourselves, and we're quite homogenous as a group of people making games. This is the one place I'm going to call it my team specifically. So we have 46% women in my team, and I would say we're quite diverse. We come from over, like, I think it's 15 different countries, and with different levels of experience and different ages. And anecdotally, I've seen how much this changes the environment of a game team and how good it feels and the different decisions and ideas that we come up with. So yes, you can find diverse people to work in the games industry if you look hard enough. And I wish we can get to 50-50. We'll try. So a bit of an overview of the problem then, as I've said it. 1, game UX is hard. It's not binary. There's no easy answers there. It's an ever-broadening audience. Everyone plays games now, as it turns out. So that's a lot of people to design for. And finally, these problems are inherent no matter like where you're going. The lack of diversity leads to this inherent bias. What I would say is no matter what industry you're working in, these are going to be similar problems. I've just framed them in a game space. So I'm hoping maybe the solutions or the ideas that I'm coming up with can help you, no matter what sort of designer you are or where you're working. So number 1, how do we fix it? How do we fix it? I don't know. The first one is to practice inclusive design. So this is a slide from the Inclusivity Design Toolkit that was released by Microsoft and is constantly updated. I really recommend this if you're any sort of designer. I was first introduced to it when I worked there, but I think any team can have value from it. So this is the idea that if you design for a person with a specific disability or difference in ability, you can make massive gains for your other users. So here we have the example of someone with one arm. And imagine I'm designing a mobile game from the ground up, and I make sure it can be played with only one hand. Now, some people will say, why do you need to do that? You know, that might be 0.05% of the population. How is that going to help people? You know, it's a tiny percentage of our users. However, if you design a game so it can be played with just one hand, someone who maybe only has one hand available to them will be able to play it even better. So someone who has their arm in a sling or has a temporary disability, they will find it easier to use. And then you have people like new parents who might often be carrying a baby around. So they will find it easier to use with one hand too. So there's these huge unintended consequences of, making, really constraining yourself in the design will actually let you make these decisions or make designs that serve a huge amount of your users, even if you were only targeting a very specific amount. The second one is building empathy within your team. We do player testing, so we show the game to people and we get their feedback and we iterate upon it. And we involve all the developers in the team within this. And it is common, and I've seen this in loads of teams, for when they're watching a video of someone playing the game, oh, she doesn't really know technology that well, or oh, he doesn't play this sort of game, so it's okay that he didn't understand it. She might just be a bit stupid. They don't say that out loud, but you know that they're thinking it. However, if you get them to give that game to their mother, they are definitely not going to say, my mom is just stupid, she doesn't get this game. So by actually trying to give your things and show them to the people around you that you care about, or getting your team to do that, they'll have more empathy for all the people that are using your thing. And we found that this has really helped us. This ties into my other point of showing people stuff. Your game or your app or your thing, whatever you're making, will always be tested. It's always going to end up in someone's hands somehow. But it's better if you do that on your terms as opposed to after you've released it. And I know how it is. It's so scary to give your stuff to people, especially if it's not done, especially if you think, oh, this could be better, this could be fixed. But the earlier you give it to someone, see what their feedback is, see what parts they like, what parts they don't understand, it gives you a driving force of a direction to go in. So as early as you can, test early and often. It will help whatever you're making. And finally, kill your biases. As I've kind of mentioned previously, we are all biased creatures. We have biases towards things and against things. We all come from different backgrounds, and that shapes what we expect from the world. The more that you recognize that you have bias, and you are a biased person, and you will make these mistakes about the people around you and the decisions you make, the earlier you'll actually notice them within your designs and be able to counteract it. So, what's the point? I think gamers are not who you immediately think they are. They're not who I immediately assumed they are before I started thinking about it. But also, games aren't. Games are so much bigger than what we thought that they could be, and I think they will continue to develop in that way. I hope. And really, sorry, I think the more that we actually design for the billions of people that are playing games and could be playing games, the better games as an art form will become. And I'm trying to make this happen. I want you all to make this happen, and I can't wait to go on this journey with all of you. Thank you.